Why should we care about Kendall Roy? Besides the fact that he's a fictional character, he's selfish, entitled, kind of an asshole, and can be pretty cringy. Even on a show populated by morally dubious and generally shitty people, Kendall manages to stand out. And yet Kendall still draws a large amount of support and affection from fans. This enigma and why it's important to our everyday lives is what I'm going to be exploring in this video. If you've seen any of my previous videos on Succession, you're well aware that I think it's one of the best shows currently on television and one of my all-time favorites. With HBO's recent confirmation that Season 4 of Succession will release in 2023, I've returned to the series with fresh eyes, and I've gained a new perspective on how the emotional dysfunctions of the Roy children were cultivated by Logan's divide-and-conquer parenting method. And there is no better microcosm for that than the relationship between Logan and his number one boy, Kendall. As Succession's de facto protagonist, the writers ensure that we're given more behind-the-facade time with Kendall. Stripped bare, we see his struggles with addiction. We see his spirited endeavors and ultimate failures, and his attempts to become a better person. In short, we see his humanity. Materialistically, Kendall is grotesquely rich and has everything he could ever want. Spiritually, he's broken and has nothing he needs. Both are the result of the father and media empire he was born into. If we want to begin to understand Kendall as a character, we have to first look toward his father. In terms of their fractured father-son relationship, a lot can be gleaned from the show's pilot episode when Logan suddenly pulls the rug out from under his son. Logan loves the empire he's built more than anything in the world, arguably more than his family. It's pretty difficult to envision the Roy patriarch doing anything other than working. Still, the choice to step down as CEO was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. The ominous approach of incoming free time was something he must have considered and accepted in principle. Something else must have triggered his decision, and I think it could be this moment here, when he reaches for and is visibly annoyed by a Forbes magazine with Kendall's face on it. The headline reads, "The heir with the flair." With a determined waddle, Logan leaves the house immediately after tossing the magazine aside. The magazine cover highlights a key theme in the Logan-Kendall dynamic, that of Logan's resentment of the privileged life he's given his kids.
You're so fucking jealous of what you've given your own kids.
If I'd spoken to my uncle like that...
What? What?
The vast majority of Logan's upbringing and backstory remains submerged under the surface. What we do know about his childhood was that it was not nearly as materialistically pleasant as that of his children. We also know that young Logan was a victim of circumstance. Born in Dundee, Scotland, upon the outbreak of the Second World War, Logan, his brother Ewan, and his mysterious sister Rose were shipped away across the ocean to Canada to live with their uncle Noah, a decision young Logan had no control over. Later in Season 1, it is implied that Noah was a cruel and abusive man who, to put it lightly, did not tolerate insubordination. Later, when Logan is going for a swim, we see scars of harsh lashings on his back. The abuse Logan suffered at the hands of his uncle may never have been spoken about, but its tremors ripple through the generations that followed. The abuse shaped Logan into who he is as a man and as a parent. It provided him with real-world adversity from a very young age. It made him strong. It taught him the pain that comes from not being in control of his life situation, something he'd spend the rest of his life working to avoid. Although we get glimpses of Logan being physically abusive, it's safe to assume it's not nearly the same magnitude of suffering doled out by his uncle Noah. Logan's methods of abuse heavily skew toward the emotional, and the psychological. Through his little games, Logan pits his children against each other, starting from an age as young as 5, shaping their malleable psyches with a toxic brand of competition. This is evidenced by the story of the dog pound game, brought up by Roman in Season 1.
He used to lock me in a cage. That's a true story. Oh wait, you're pretending that you don't remember the dog pound. I had to go climb in this big dog cage in the kitchen and wait for someone to come collect me.
It was a game. You enjoyed it.
I
ask
enjoyed
Connor.
it.
Yeah, ask Connor. He enjoyed it, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you did too. Dad's theory was you got 2 fighting dogs, you send the weak one away. You punish the weak one, so away he went.
The fact that the dog pound still weighs heavily on Roman's mind and Kendall's shove in the elevator illustrates the effectiveness of Logan's mental programming. It begins to answer the question of how Logan traumatized his kids. The question of why, however, is still left unanswered. In trying to come up with an answer, I was reminded of Devil Bill Rockefeller. Devil Bill was a notorious con man and literal snake oil salesman. Although not nearly as successful and wealthy as his son John D. Rockefeller, or Logan Roy for that matter, Devil Bill's parenting strategy mirrors Logan's. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," Devil Bill once confided in a friend. "I trade with the boys and skin 'em. I just beat 'em every time I can. I want to make 'em sharp." There's a historical cliche that I believe fits in pretty well here. Strong men create good times, and good times create weak men. A brief scroll through the history books will tend to confirm this. Connor, Shiv, Roman, and Kendall all grew up within a pampered bubble, a blissful bubble, but one with the potential to poison the kids with their own privilege. Lingering in this bubble saps you of your urgency. It makes you complacent and dull. We could argue that this is what happened with the conflict-adverse Connor. Knowing his successor would have to be sharp, Logan played the kids off each other to spark the necessary urgency within them and to see who would emerge as his worthy successor. But the throne of Waystar may not be the top prize Kendall and his siblings are really after. The real reward is the affection and admiration Logan withheld from them in childhood. In Kendall's own words, he was trained to worship the ground his father walked on. Wherever Logan walked, Kendall shuffled behind him, hidden under his father's towering shadow. In the world of media, image is paramount. Logan enjoys the image of the self-made media magnate. Kendall's image, however, to the outside world, is an unfavorable one. That of the spoiled rich kid who'd be nothing without daddy and his money. At home, his father was consumed with forging his empire. His mother is, and we can safely assume was, emotionally unavailable. And his relationships with his siblings were more like rivalries, contorted by the competition instilled in them by Logan. Ken's emotionally troubled family life drilled a deep well of trauma and pain within him in his formative years. This is one perspective from which we can begin to look at Ken's battles with addiction. Many doctors and anointed medical authorities present the issue of addiction as being purely genetic, or worse, as a choice or a failure of character or will. Several doctors, however, have come to disagree with this paradigm. One of them is Dr. Gabor Mate, who spent decades working firsthand with addicts in his hometown of Vancouver. Mate's theory is that for the addict, addiction is not the primary problem. The addiction is their attempt to solve the underlying problem that stems from emotional trauma incepted in childhood. From the time we meet Kendall, and assumably from childhood, his primary goal is to win Logan's acceptance and admiration, and to prove his business savviness to the world. He wants to be recognized for his own merit, to prove that he belongs in his position and could have attained it regardless of the circumstances of his birth. Kendall seeks the temporary alleviation offered by drugs, whenever he is bested by his father. He relapses shortly after losing the no confidence vote, resulting in a binge that erases his leverage over his father and debilitates the bear hug maneuver. In Season 2, he sinks further into his vices to cope with the fallout of his failure and the guilt of the waiter's death. In Season 3, Ken finally skids off the rails at his birthday party when he can't find the gifts from his kids in a mountain of presents. He's reached his peak of emptiness, and his empire of excess crumbles around him. After being totally beholden to his father throughout Season 2, Ken curates his identity in the following season as the polar opposite of his father. Where Logan is cutthroat, crooked, and corrupt, Ken tries to package himself as humble, ethical, and moral. In this moment of the birthday party, Ken, however, comes to realize how similar he really is to his father. Ken is mostly absent from the lives of his children, outsourcing the duties of parenthood to a troop of nannies and assistants, choosing instead to devote his time and energy toward the company. This is just one suppository of the truth that is forced onto Kendall. Before we dive into the full dose of truth that finally breaks him, it's important to momentarily return to Dr. Mate's paradigm of addiction. He connects the emotional trauma that facilitates addiction to a binary of fundamental human needs. Those needs are attachment and authenticity, connection to others, and connection to ourselves, respectively. Viewed through Mate's lens, the objective of Kendall's journey through the first 3 seasons is to unite and satisfy both these needs. Attachment is the need that is the most urgent in early childhood. As we know, we are incredibly vulnerable as infants and need to be protected from physical harm. Beyond that, we humans are social creatures by nature. Healthy relationships and successful attachments, especially with members of our family, are conducive to emotional health. With Logan as their father, this is a deficit Kendall and his siblings find themselves in from birth. Being that the Roy kids are groomed from childhood to replace their father, and opportunities to form attachments are already at a low, it leaves little room for them to form authenticity. Logan punishes his kids when they try to individuate. For example, Logan verbally abuses Shiv for working for one of his main political rivals. He then dangles the allure of attachment at her by disingenuously offering her the top role at Waystar. Generally, people suppress authenticity in favor of attachment. Perhaps because the degree of importance attachment has at a young age remains hardwired in us throughout life. Regardless, discarding our authenticity is a surefire way to lose connection with ourselves. That's when the existential questions come knocking. Who am I, and where am I going? This trauma that arises from the conflict between attachment and authenticity can seemingly only be solved by the fleeting solace of drugs and other addictive activities. Kendall spends Season 2 as his father's lackey. In Season 1, Ken would have spoken out about Logan's dinosaurish dedication to buying local TV networks. In Season 2, Ken toes the line and backs all of his father's moves and defends him valiantly in Congress. Even, it appears, the move that would send Kendall to jail to spare Logan from facing accountability. Ken was restrained by Logan's leverage, the cover-up of the waiter's death, but a part of him doubtlessly believed that, even if he wasn't destined to be CEO, he could still win some degree of attachment from his father.
He loves me. I think it's just a wrong kind of love expression.
And he loves the wrong thing. That's what he loves.
When Ken asks Logan if he thought he could ever have filled his shoes, his father responds. This is one of the most iconic lines in the series. It's the line that inspired this video.
You're not a killer. You have to be a killer.
Why isn't Kendall a killer?
Who said I never killed anyone?
The reason isn't because he failed to take over the company, nor is it because he's weak, soft, or green. Kendall isn't a killer because his father is Logan Roy. Logan is also an addict. His addiction for work formed in his early years as a result of the lack of attachment from his parents, his brother, and his uncle Noah, and an unease about the lack of control that caused it in the first place. Logan came to see life as a game, and he resolved to never lose. Moreover, he resolved to always be on top, so that nothing and nobody external could ever become the master of his fate again. Kendall and his siblings' attempts to take over are viewed by Logan as nothing short of an existential threat. To lose is to die. This is likely why the writers of Succession relentlessly frame the Roy children's takeover attempts as, quote, killings. Logan's obsession with winning is borderline morbid. The most disturbing extent of this is when Logan smacks his grandson Iverson, simply because he told his grandfather that he lost at a made-up game. Winning is the temporary solution to his permanent problem, his emotional trauma, which is why he can never retire and rest. As a consequence, he's condemned to a lifetime of disconnection from his loved ones. Winning consumed Logan to the point of completely abandoning morals and ethics if they posed an obstacle. In Season 3, Kendall asserts his authenticity from his father by adopting a persona that is completely contrary to everything Logan stands for, cloaking himself in righteousness. Subconsciously, Kendall decides that if winning admiration and attachment from his father is an impossible task, he will seek it out from the world at large. As we know, this doesn't get him very far. Ken's odyssey through Season 3 is one of denial. His posturing as a corporate knight on horseback is bought by some, but rejected by most in favor of that spoiled rich boy image attached to him.
Okay, he clearly has mental health issues and crazy guilt coupled with addiction, and it's sad.
Kendall is emotionally disingenuous from the start of the season. He projects positivity when he's uncertain of himself and his position. There's a core truth to his character that he spends the whole season trying to outrun. A little bit of that truth is sprinkled on him with Shiv's open letter, and it nearly breaks him. The episode of Kendall's birthday party begins with him rehearsing a song he plans to perform later that night. That song is Honesty by Billy Joel. Ironically, that's what Kendall avoids confronting until the season's penultimate episode, when he has an ominous sit-down with his father. Ken is completely broken at this point and just wants to get bought out. But Logan won't accept his resignation when Ken asserts his morality. "I'm better than you," Kendall tells his father, after characterizing him as corrupt and evil. Moral supremacy is the last thread Kendall has to hang on to, the last thread of his authenticity, the only barrier separating him from the monster that is his father.
I don't want to be you. I'm a good guy.
But Logan can't lose. He slices that last thread and deals his son a finishing blow.
Whenever you fucked up, I cleaned up your shit.
This truth does not set Ken free. It destroys him. His delusions of righteousness and authentic merit have been obliterated. He isn't better than his father. His crusade against his father was simply a child's game that was only allowed to unfold because of Logan's cover-up. Kendall isn't a champion for victims or a defender of justice. He's a direct beneficiary of his father's wickedness and corruption. Without it, Ken would have nothing and be nothing. Ken is forced to take a good long look in the mirror, and it leads to what is arguably a suicide attempt, and what is definitely his darkest headspace in the series. Logan withdrew adequate attachment from his kids in childhood, hoping to sharpen them into killers. An appropriate amount of stress and pressure strengthens a muscle. However, too much stress and pressure, and the muscle tears. Kendall isn't a killer because of who his father is. Logan's win-or-die attitude His distance as a parent and the sheer pressure he imposed on his number one boy was a weight heavy enough to finally break him. So, why is this important? Though inspired by real families of infinite wealth and influence, Succession is, after all, a piece of fiction. For many, it's just something to watch every Sunday night as they drift off to sleep. But I think it has much more significance than that. There's a reason why we gather around the TV every Sunday to slip into stories like Succession, the same way we used to gather around a fire and hear our tribe exchange tall tales. Stories have always been a primary way of understanding the mysterious world around us and absorbing lessons to optimize our ways of living. If there's a lesson to be learned from Logan and Kendall's tempestuous relationship, it's in the cyclical nature of abuse and emotional trauma. Kendall is the way he is because of the abuse from Logan, who is the way he is because of the abuse from his Uncle Noah, and so on and so on. Kendall isn't the only victim of Logan's neglectful parenting. It bleeds through the next generation and causes Ken to prioritize business over his own kids. The cyclical nature of abuse likely exists within all families in some form. This doesn't mean, however, that we are without agency and doomed to suffer the consequences of past circumstances. We need not be enslaved to these cycles. It is possible to break them and recover connections to others and to ourselves. By the end of Season 3, it seems Kendall's relationship with his father may be unsalvageable. But, despite being as down as ever, despite potentially losing his stake in the company and the renewed inquiry into the drowned waiter, Ken bands together with his siblings for the first time in the series. Now that they are on the outside looking in for the first time in their lives, they will have to rely on each other and build their connections to each other from scratch.